Welcome everybody. This is Alaina. I'm the Associate Director of the Abbasi Program in Islamic Studies. Today is a very special day for us because it is a reunion. So over here, Zach Al-Butri used to be former Associate Director of the Abbasi Program. And at the same time, I was a postdoc, and at the same time, Alaina was a postdoc. So that's what makes it quite special for us as well, personally. Today, I'm going to give the privilege to introduce our guest, to Zach Al-Butri, who personally volunteered to do that. Let's see what he has to say.
Really very happy to introduce the speaker today, Dr. Alaina Morgan, a professor of the history department at the University of Southern California. She's also my friend. As Tony said, we were sort of all together at Stanford for a couple of years. And so I have this great opportunity to say something embarrassing about her, which I hope will be over a 10-year case. So Dr. Morgan will be speaking about her recently published book, Crescent, which the Abbasi program actually had some hand in seeing come to fruition. As some of you, as you heard, that Alaina was a postdoc here, and at that time, Lisa Blades hosted a manuscript workshop for the dissertation, which became the basis of this book, maybe. Okay. So she and I had both started around the same time. I was the associate director and kind of grew up here, and it's nice to be back in the study. And then stepped away from Islamic studies, and reflecting back, I think that helping to support junior scholars like Alaina is the thing I'm most proud of, and also Leo, and I believe to be sort of one of the most impactful ways that programs like this can further the mission of scholarship at a university, hosting and providing the resources for fellowships like these can make a big difference, especially when departments don't necessarily have the incentives to do that. The School of Medicine has hundreds of postdoctoral scholars of sciences too, but it is increasingly needed in the humanities to have bridging fellowship years to have launch an academic career. That is my plug for postdocs. And by creating a postdoctoral fellowship for Alaina, the Abbasi program can take some credit in her success. And the faculty in religious studies and CCSRE who supported her also. But quite frankly, as her administrative support here, I was forced to go to extraordinary lengths to support her, and I should personally be given a lot of the credit for her success. Dr. Morgan was a huge help to me, and I'll give you a few examples why. Folding laundry for your postdoc is not the typical part of a job description of a department administrator. Why can't you go to a laundromat? Why does this need to happen in my home? Driving your postdoc from her home in Oakland to Stanford and back in your car. That is not what we mean by supporting young scholars. At the very least, contribute to the bridge toll. Having said postdoc give an interview to a local TV station in your living room, in your wedding suit jacket, that is not typical support for postdocs at Stanford or anywhere else. And to this day, I am forced to endure her takes on the latest salacious Canadian hockey television, in which I stated repeatedly I have no interest. Dr. Morgan asked her a lot while she was here, and seemed to have considerable difficulty taking no for an answer and accepting the limitations of the university's financial policies. She was a wonderful partner to the program, but she was only ever able to meet if lunch was involved, an expense to the program, with a pre-meeting to discuss the agenda, also over lunch, preferably at Asian Box. By clever accounting and judicious lapses of memory, she was able to stretch her allotted research budget to fund additional field research in Bermuda, archival trips to London, the latest Apple MacBook Pro. Graduate students in the audience would do well to learn from Dr. Martin about her various strategies for self-advocacy within an institutional setting of university. She can teach any one of you how to find your own Zach outwitry. So maybe there's a conversation about whether she was being paid enough while she was here, but I can truly say that while Alaina asked for a lot, it was always readily given and gladly because she's so charming. As demanding as she is deserving, she did a lot for the program. For me, she was beloved by her students and her classes, always ready to engage, never desperate to hide away in her office, and clears all of us a scholar with a very bright path ahead of her. And rather than claiming any credit, we're just very lucky to have had any part in her journey. And with that, I'll give it over to you.
In July, my book, Crescent, Building Geographies of Black and Muslim Liberation in the African Diaspora, finally came out. And so I'm really excited to share it all with you. And so please be very gentle. This is my first book talk. Okay. In either the late summer or early fall of 1977, the exact timing is a little unclear, former Bermudian Nation of Islam member Michelle Khaldun and her husband George received a phone call at their East Elmhurst, New York home. I think we have to envision here a very typical 1970s domestic setup. Maybe some brown floral couches, maybe a pea soup green shag rug. George is maybe in some salmon-colored bell bottoms, something that my dad used to wear all the time in the 70s, according to my mom. And he's on one wired phone in the kitchen. Michelle, her belly swollen with her third and final pregnancy, is leaning against the door frame with the extra long spiraled cord, if anybody remembers those, from the living room phone wrapped around her like a straitjacket. George and Michelle listened intently to the caller as he spoke. But when they hung up the phone, they couldn't help but express to each other their confusion, their internal conflicts, their doubts, and their caution. Who is it that could have possibly evoked this type of reaction? It turns out that the Khalduns' mystery caller was Louis Farrakhan. At that moment, Farrakhan was in the midst of a campaign to drum up support for a potential relaunch of the Nation of Islam. Only 2 years prior, in February 1975, Elijah Muhammad, the supreme leader of the Nation of Islam, died, and his son Wallace assumed control of the organization. Wallace had frequently sparred with his father about the theological teachings of the nation. And as soon as he assumed power, he transitioned the organization away from their particularist teachings, such as the idea that Elijah Muhammad was a prophet of Islam, and toward Sunni Islam, things like instructing the congregation in prayer, in Quran, and in traditional Islamic education, albeit targeted and tailored for a Black audience. Although Farrakhan initially pledged to support Wallace, he felt marginalized and powerless, and he soon abandoned the organization. By 1977, when he called the Khalduns, Farrakhan was feeling strong enough to test his ability to relaunch the nation with himself at the helm. But first, he needed to secure his support base, and thus, he began reaching out to his most loyal supporters, people like George and Michelle Khaldun. Just a few years prior, in the early 1970s, during Elijah Muhammad's reign, the Khalduns were active members of the nation and part of Farrakhan's inner circle in New York. Farrakhan introduced George, who had joined the nation after leaving a gang in Kelowna, Queens, and Michelle, who had emigrated from the tiny Atlantic island of Bermuda and taught children's classes at the nation's University of Islam School in Harvard. In Bermuda, Michelle came to the nation through her experience with Bermudian independence, and after her involvement with the Bermudian version of the Black Panther Party, the Black Beret Cadre. At 17, after high school graduation, Michelle left Bermuda to see the world. She told her mother she was going to visit colleges in the United States, but it would be decades before she returned home. In 1971, she arrived in New York with her best friend. By 1972, Farrakhan had set her up with George, who she would later marry, and with whom she would have 3 children. They were, until Muhammad's death, one of Farrakhan's closest friends and allies. But the transition to Sunni Islam in 1975 started to change that. Not necessarily their personal relationship with him, but their thoughts about whether or not he could lead them into a Black and Muslim future. If his particular interpretation of Islam suited their own religious and political identities at this point in American history, in Atlantic history, and in world history, George and Michelle had, like so many other Muslims in the Atlantic world, at this time and at various other times, real choices to make about what suited them and what intellectual and spiritual frameworks drove forward their political projects and their battles against empire, anti-colonialism, and white supremacy. My book, Atlantic Crescent, Building Geographies of Black and Muslim Liberation in the African Diaspora, is an intellectual, political, and religious history of how Black and Muslim people used Islam and the geographic space of what I call the Muslim Atlantic, or Atlantic Crescent, as a unifying anti-colonial and anti-imperial mechanism. I argue that beginning in the years surrounding the First World War and continuing until at least the 1990s, Black people saw an incredible potential in Islam. They saw Islam as having a unique and special ability to unify oppressed populations, to remedy social ills, and to achieve racial and political freedom. By the time my story begins, at the turn of the 20th century, there are no American-born Black communities in the United States who identify themselves as Muslim. George and Michelle's prequel begins here, at this moment, when the memories that Black people had of Islam, which was practiced openly and in secret at various times during the antebellum period, had ruptured. And at this time, in the first third of the 20th century, three diasporas collide with each other, creating the perfect conditions by which Islam could begin to take hold in Black communities, and from its inception, begin to articulate a relationship between freedom and Islamic practice. The most well-known of these diasporas is the Great Migration. Historians kind of date this. I mean, historians have to disagree about everything, right? So 1910s to 1930, or about 1915 to 1930 are typically the dates. And during this period, about 1 million African Americans travel to the northern and midwestern United States in search of refuge from poverty, exploitation, and racial violence, and with the promise of employment in the industrial and manufacturing sectors. Scholars of religion have noted how religion and spirituality became a critical outlet for Black people to articulate a religious and racial identity in opposition to white supremacy, and to develop strategies to oppose it. And the Great Migration and its context is critical to the reclamation of and development of a Black and Muslim practice and identity in the United States. It lays bare the deep entrenchment of white supremacy and racial hierarchy everywhere in American society, and it belies the notion that outrunning it was as simple as a change of scenery to a higher latitude. Thus, I take up African American historian Earl Lewis's call to examine the history of African America and of Black people globally as a history of overlapping diasporas. And I argue that it's not just the Great Migration that creates the conditions for Black Islam to flourish in America's inner cities, something that has been well represented in the literature, but also that it is the presence of two other lesser known and rarely linked diasporas that enable this to happen. So the first of these intersecting diasporas is that of Afro-Caribbean intellectuals and skilled laborers to the United States at the beginning of the 20th century. This is concurrent with the Great Migration. From about 1900 to 1937, 80,000 immigrants from the Caribbean migrate to the United States. And these migrants, who are overwhelmingly from the Anglophone Caribbean, are pushed to leave their home islands due to a number of factors, but mostly agricultural devastation, lack of educational opportunities, and general unemployment. They're also pulled to the United States by the same factory and industrial jobs that entice African Americans to migrate from the southern United States. This Afro-Caribbean diaspora thus necessarily comes into contact with the African-American one from the South. And that's because no matter how much Afro-Caribbean people desperately want to separate themselves from Black Americans, entrenched racial hierarchies made it so that they were living in the same racially segregated tenements. They were competing for the same poorly paid, unskilled jobs, and subject to the same restrictions around movement. But the Caribbean diaspora is made up of mostly skilled laborers and educated people. And that produces a very interesting dynamic, because a lot of these people will come from contexts in which they're involved in union organizing on their home islands, and they're intellectuals in their own right by the time they migrate to the United States. And one of the most well-known of these is Jamaican-born Marcus Garvey, who starts his Universal Negro Improvement Association in 1913, after traveling to Panama and Costa Rica as a young man and observing the horrible labor conditions of Black workers and their connection to the growth of empire and white wealth. And through the UNIA's newspaper, The Negro World, Garvey began to develop his ideas of Black nationalism, including separatism and self-sufficiency, Pan-Africanism, and Afro-Asian solidarity. And these ideas become adapted by Muslim leaders, Black Muslim leaders, including Noble Drew Ali, who established the Moorish Science Temple of America in Newark, New Jersey in 1913, and codifies his philosophies in 1917, right in the crux of the Great Migration and the Afro-Caribbean diaspora. And W.D. Fard Muhammad, who there's some debate about where he's from, but he was probably of Pakistani descent, and he establishes the Nation of Islam in 1930 in Detroit. Both of these organizations have strong Black nationalist and internationalist underpinnings and emphasize an Afro-Asiatic identity. And this later gets translated by Black and Muslim people in the African diaspora into Pan-Islamic and Third World solidarities. And the third diaspora, okay, so sorry, this is just enough with the Caribbean. The third diaspora of interest is that of South Asians to the United States during the same period. From about 1900 to 1930, the United States' population of documented residents from what was then British India grew from about 2,000 in 1900 to almost 6,000 in 1930. This sounds like a really small number because it is a really small number. It's only a net increase of less than 4,000 people. And in comparison to something like European migration, which saw an increase of about 3 million people during the same period, it seems minuscule. It's minuscule even in comparison to Caribbean migration. But there are several factors going on during this period, right? This is the era of Chinese exclusion and of the Asiatic barred zone. There's a quota system which privileges European immigration. But I think that part of the reason that I think it's important to focus on this is to dismiss the contributions of this group because of their small numbers does a really horrible disservice to the history of Islam in America. There are a lot of loopholes in these laws. A lot of people come in as educators and religious missionaries. Oftentimes people come in, as they always have, undocumented. And it is more the way that immigrants from the Indian subcontinent here occupy a very fluid racial position, that they are not Black per se, but certainly not white, that allows them to have mobility and visibility in these communities. Because of their skin color, they have to take up residence in the same communities that African American and Afro-Caribbean people reside in. Historians have demonstrated how these immigrants, many of them from Muslim regions of the Indian subcontinent, integrated into Black communities, and as a result began to influence the development of cultural and religious institutions like Islam. I've already brought up how W.D. Fard, for instance, was probably Pakistani, and the Ahmadiyya Muslim mission in America, which was started in the Punjab in the late 19th century, actively recruited and missionized among Black Americans. And it very much had very strong ties to the Garvey movement. So in Atlantic Crescent, I talk in greater depth about the intellectual environment enabled by these three diasporas, and how the different iterations of Black Islam that were forged at the intersections of these diasporas, at the intersections of these diasporas, combined with the political and cultural movements of the day. Movements like anti-colonialism, Black nationalism, Third World solidarity, anti-war movements, and Pan-Africanism. And together, these movements and the people involved in them, through ideas and actions, reconfigured prevailing notions of race, space, and place. These Muslim traditions sometimes redefined and sometimes rejected what it meant to be a Black person, at the same time as they reconfigured local and global geographies. Here, continents merged, populations thousands of miles away from each other became part of the same history, and global communities were united across distance by their shared religious beliefs. Although often conservative in their gender politics and economics, these movements imagined a radical reality dramatically different from the racial status quo. I examined a large variety of documents, including government archives, private papers, newspapers, and periodicals, all things that Zach pointed out the Boston program helped me pay for, cheers to. Looking for things like how they are laid out, right? I looked at newspapers and periodicals for how these articles were laid out, how these references were laid out, and how various articles spoke to each other in the same visual space, as well as things like letters to the editor. And I used oral histories. And that's how I got Michelle and George's story. I lived with Michelle for a month while I was in Bermuda, during our archival research there, and also interviewing people of the Muslim community. So these three diasporas fed these radical imaginaries, allowing Black and Muslim people to make sense of their subjugation by putting their local experiences into global context and inscribing them within a powerful transnational community. So I call this process of reimagining Black Muslim history, belonging, and solidarity a Black Muslim geography of imperial resistance. An imaginary where Black and Muslim identities were transposed on non-white populations fighting against white supremacy and colonial violence. Some of this geography of imperial resistance was created and reinforced through visuals, things like maps and the creation of alternative world maps that reimagined geopolitical power. Sometime around 1917, Noble Drew Ali, the leader of the Mars Science Temple, developed the idea of a mexam, which he imagined to be a supercontinent, something like Pangea, that allowed him to argue for a primordial connection between Black people and Islam. So you can see kind of the, right, like this is his kind of vision, right, like of, and it's interesting because at this time, theories of continental drift are actually just making it into the mainstream, right? So they go from being like very fringe ideas to something that people actually are talking about, and that the New York Times is discussing as something that, as we know now, right, is actually, does have scientific basis. And Drew is pulling on this in order to kind of reinforce his vision of, right, like Afro-Asian solidarity and Black Muslim identity. Almost 50 years later, in March of 1966, several events prompted the Nation of Islam to publish this alternative world map in Muhammad Speaks, its organizational newspaper. That year, European empire continued to retreat, not without a fight. Both Botswana and Lesotho were set to gain their independence from the United Kingdom later that year. The Cold War and the space race between the USA and the USSR was intensifying. Over the course of that year, the United States would double the number of troops on the ground in Vietnam, and both the USSR and the USA would launch their first unmanned shuttles to the moon. On a domestic level, the civil rights movement pushed forward, inducing violent responses by federal and local law enforcement officials. Since the beginning of its publication in 1960, Muhammad Speaks had made sense of these events for the Black and Muslim public, weaving the complex interconnections between the subjugation of Black and brown people in America's inner cities with the colonial and neo-colonial projects. So amid articles about the United States' involvement in Vietnam and the general process of decolonization, this map appeared as a centerfold for the March 1966 issue of Muhammad Speaks. The newspaper itself Right, and so right in the middle, right, we see this alternative world map. This is clearly not, right, like a standard Mercator projection. This is not the type of map, right, that you learned about in primary or secondary school, right? Instead, we see the United States, Canada, and Mexico, and the Caribbean in the center. But it's not to suggest that the United States is more important, but rather that the United States is a source of global evil. And here we see it coiling over, this serpent coiling over every body of water, choking almost every continent, the Indian subcontinent, Southeast Asia, the Caribbean, Latin America, and Australia, and emphasizing the changing geopolitical landscape of the time, and the continued rise of the United States in building empire and impressing Black, brown, and indigenous people across the world. And the only areas really that the serpent doesn't touch are Cuba, Saudi Arabia, the birthplace of the Islamic tradition, and the European continent, where the then current imperial project had emerged. And we see in Europe, which is fading into kind of the edge of the map, the serpent's tail is retreating from the continent, which emphasizes a new world order defined by the escalating tensions of the Cold War. Eugene Majid, who's the political cartoonist for the Nation, his World Serpent is not meant to be a commentary only on geopolitics or on American neo-imperialism. It also very clearly defines Christianity's role in perpetuating empire, Islam's role in fighting it, and the specific utility of Elijah Muhammad's particularist interpretation of Islam. And we see that in this caption on the map: the serpent deceived the whole world, and in the opposite corner, the cartoon emphasizes Islam's role in countering American imperialism, declaring that to heal the poisonous bite of the world serpent, the cure lays in medicine that God gives Elijah Muhammad. In addition to these visual imaginaries and geographies, Islam also imparts its own alternative and subaltern geography. Muslim people see themselves as linked by the concept of the Ummah, the universal imagined Muslim community. In theory, that community transcends national boundaries, ethnic groups, languages, cultures, and styles of worship. And together, members of the Ummah are supposed to be united by one thing: their desire to submit fully to Allah. But this identity is often held in tandem with another type of belonging in a local or tribal community called the Asabiya. And as religious studies scholars have suggested, this tension between the Ummah and the Asabiya and the ways that they each define the Black and Muslim experience is a primary preoccupation for Black and Muslim people in a contemporary Atlantic world. How exactly do they demonstrate and profess belonging to a global community while dealing with the particularities of their histories? So to explain how the freedom dreams and discourses of people like Louis Farrakhan, Wallace Muhammad, Elijah Muhammad, and Noble Drew-Ali interacted with the freedom realities of rank-and-file practitioners of Islam like Michelle and George, I theorize a space I call the Atlantic Crescent. This space represents the fluid ways that Black and Muslim people intellectualized, understood, and acted on their religio-racial identities at the intersection of these overlapping diasporas. People like George and Michelle, who are at the heart of this story, shaped the Atlantic Crescent as they reflected their racial identities on it. Like geometric shape, the Atlantic Crescent comprises both convex and concave sides. The convex face stretches out transnationally, linking local Muslim communities with the Ummah, and by contrast, its concave face reflects inward, making sense of the unique local racial implications of colonialism and imperialism on various asabiyat throughout the African diaspora. Within this space, Black people translate these discourses to their own context across time and space. And of course, this sometimes results in unevenness. It results in confusion and in contradictions, but I think that that's actually the most fun part of all of this. So, just a very brief chapter outline. So in part one of my book, entitled Discourses, I discuss the ways that Black Muslim leaders used various forms of media, including recordings, institutional newspapers, Black and mainstream newspapers, political cartoons to reflect the geographies of imperial resistance that I just discussed. Moving from the turn of the 20th century to the 1960s, I discussed Noble Durali and Moorish Science Temple of America, the Ahmadiyya's American leader, Mufti Muhammad Sadiq, Talib Dawood, an Antiguan immigrant to the United States, and the Muslim Brotherhood USA, an offshoot of the Ahmadiyya, the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, and Sunni Muslims like Abdullah Sigmahi, a Pakistani journalist that was associated with the Nation of Islam. This section discusses how these leaders created a discourse intellectualizing, negotiating, and acting on their religio-racial identities. But as George and Michelle's story shows, the Atlantic Crescent is not only shaped by leaders and elites, by mostly the men that I have mentioned, but also by rank and file practitioners who adopted Islam because of the impact that they hoped that it would have on their lives. These men and women heard the sermons given by these leaders, saw the articles and political cartoons expressed in the newspapers, and decided how they would interpret these words. Some had a little bit more leeway than others. So in part two, no, sorry. Sorry. Okay, can you please fix that?
Yes.
I think I just clicked on, yeah, okay. Thanks again, Zach. Okay, so, so in part two translations, I explore how rank and file members translated the discourses of men associated with the Nation of Islam and its successors in ways that made sense for them. They expressed both internal and external crises, leading decisions about what movement spoke most clearly to them and why. And so, I want to tell you a story that I think perfectly encapsulates these dynamics, the intersection of discourse and translation, the push and pull of the Ummah and the Asabiyya, and the specific thought processes that went into decisions about faith and politics. This is a story about Michelle and her friends and family in Bermuda, how they eventually came to associate Islam with freedom and with anti-colonialism, and how their interpretation of Islam manifested in a dramatically different way than in the United States or elsewhere in the Atlantic world. And that this material comes out of chapter 4 of the book, which is about Black Muslim resistance and decolonization in translation in Bermuda. Just a little bit about Bermuda, because a lot of people don't know anything about it, right? It's a very small island, it's about 21 square miles, and as you can see, it's smack in the middle of the Atlantic. It was historically used as an outpost during kind of the age of the transatlantic slave trade, the age of kind of exploration. And it is off the coast of the Carolinas. It's about, and it's on the same latitude. So it has a different type of temperature. It was never a plantation economy like other islands in the Caribbean. It actually technically is not in the Caribbean, although I argue that it's discursively a part of the Caribbean. It has a lot of the same dynamics. It had mostly a shipbuilding and pearl diving industries. And that industry, shipbuilding, right, and the docks, still make a huge part of Bermuda's economy. And its history as an outpost in the middle of the Atlantic informs the way that information about Islam is able to get onto the island, the way that it's able to be integrated into public discourse, and the way that Black people incorporate it as one of their options, right? So this is kind of just a brief of the map. It's a very tiny island, right? So you're not going to see it on a big zoomed out map of the Atlantic. So I want to tell you about the reclamation of Islam in Bermuda, and I want to tell you about the choices that people like Michelle and her friends made and how, when translated from the American discourse of leaders like Elijah Muhammad, it looked quite different and served a much different political role. So we'll start in the middle of the 20th century. In the mid-1950s, a poor young black man named Dilton Matthews packed his bag and stowed away in a cargo ship bound for New York from Bermuda. Matthews left his home island hoping to find a better life, but misfortune found him, and he found himself somehow in Harlem homeless, hungry, and freezing cold. But in his first stroke of luck since he boarded that ship, he stumbled on an Ahmadiyya-run soup kitchen. Its tantalizing aromas and warmth luring him in from the cold. It was there that the Caribbean intersected once again with African America, South Asia, and the African diaspora. At the soup kitchen, Matthews met an Eritrean man named Ibrahim Gula, who, as he had no doubt done countless times before, introduced this poor young black man to Islam. Changing his name to Sayyid Ramadan, Matthews symbolically shed his old identity and joined himself to the global Muslim community. Ramadan became Bermuda's first known Muslim convert of the 20th century, but it's years before there's going to be another convert. In 1957, he goes back to Bermuda and he attempts to spread the message of Ahmadi Islam with no luck. And a lot of things are against him at this point in history. Anglicanism is extremely deeply entrenched in the black community. Black Bermudians had begun to agitate for civil rights, including universal suffrage, to have equal representation in government, and to be represented in unions. But there are very few changes to the status of the island's black majority. And so it's in this context that Ramadan leaves the island again in 1959 and goes back to the United States. And this time he goes to Chicago, a target of the Great Migration, and a city that is at this point a hotbed of black Muslim radicalism, including the headquarters of the Nation of Islam. And at this moment, the nation is front and center in the mainstream media. Ramadan is the perfect person to be converted, right? He's been primed by the Ahmadi message. He's attuned to conversation about black rights and freedom, and he's ready for the nation's black nationalist, particularist Islamic practice. This time when Ramadan flies back to Bermuda in late 1959, the island actually has been transformed politically. There's been a boycott of the island's segregated theaters and a strike of mostly black dock workers, which politicizes the island's black population and kicks off an intense period of racially motivated political activity in Bermuda. After this, Ramadan is able to successfully recruit followers, and in concert with their relatives and friends who work on the cruise ships that have begun, by this point, begun to dock in Bermuda's port, they began to import Muhammad Speaks newspapers to the island. This small group of Muslims grew to have a disproportionate impact on the island's political situation, creating a dynamic that would have been at best discouraged and at worst would have been cause for exile or expulsion from the Nation of Islam in the United States. By 1960, Nation of Islam recordings served as a type of soundtrack during meetings for politically active black youth, not necessarily Muslims or Nation of Islam members, just people who were very politically aware, where they would meet to discuss strategies to force the issue of universal suffrage. In the early 1960s, a group of Nation of Islam members joined with members of the British Communist Party to form a short-lived political party called the Bermuda United Workers' Party, which, at least according to British police services, had appeared to start preparing itself for violent political action, including the use of incendiary devices and explosives. By 1966, amid a government crackdown on the Nation of Islam and a ban on copies of Muhammad Speaks, members of the nation involved themselves directly in discussions regarding Bermudian independence, the effects of government censorship, and the role of the labor movement on the island. By 1967, the strongest union on the island, a union of dock workers, was controlled by 3 black Muslim leaders and launched a campaign to remove the ban on the newspaper, which actually, as a side note, the ban is actually still in place. It's not enforced, but it's just interesting that it was never actually repealed. And although nobody's really ever been arrested for it recently, people are still very reluctant to speak about their possession of it. And they're very proud about their ability to have acquired these newspapers during this period. So these are some newspapers that one of my subjects had collected, and he's not the only person to have kept every single one of the Mohammed Speaks newspapers that he was able to acquire during this period. A lot of people got them, stored them in storage spaces, stored them under floorboards, put them in suitcases, right? So there is some caution about kind of showing them to outsiders, but at the same time, people like actually are very proud of their ability to acquire them. One of my subjects said that they were more valuable, right, than cash, than actual cash. Okay, so it seems, right, during this period of time, right, whenever there's a protest, whenever there's an opportunity to oppose the government's oppression of Black people or the oligarchy's exploitation of Black workers, the nation is right there. And this is really, really unusual. This doesn't happen anywhere else, right? And I'm not gonna talk about that anymore because I wanna wrap up a little bit soon just for questions, but I'm happy to talk about this more in Q&A. One of the strangest things about Burmese Islam was its very close relationship with Black power. A relationship, again, that was not present at all in the United States or elsewhere. In the summer of 1969, a group of young Burmese between the ages of 16 and 30 gathered under the leadership of a man called John Hilton Bobby Bassett Jr. to form the Black Beret Cadre, an organization molded on the American Black Panther Party. It's a very similar organization. They have a multi-point program. They demanded freedom, sovereignty, housing, education, jobs, right, an end to police brutality, and political justice. The message is also very similar to the Nation of Islam, except that the Black Beret Cadre eschewed religion and religious escapism by Black Burmese and held that capitalism was the primary cause of subjugation of Burmese Black population. But there is enough similarity that, for instance, Nation of Islam members would send their children to the Black Beret Cadre's liberation school on the weekends, right, to learn Black history and self-defense and about environmental racism, right, and police violence. There's an ideological proximity, but the interesting thing is, and this is the thing about small islands and why this particular case study is very interesting and why I focused actually 2 chapters, right, of the book on this island, right, is there's a physical proximity between these 2 groups. In 1969 and 1970, the nation and the Black Beret Cadre share a meeting space in downtown Hamilton, Bermuda. And so this was taken in 2015, and now it's kind of retail space on the bottom. But this is the old build. This is the building, right? They used to do their meetings in. It's called the Bassett Building. No direct relation to the leader of the Black Beret Cadre, but Burmese are interesting in that oftentimes, right, the white Burmese are descendants of the people that own the Black Burmese with the same last names. And it's a very small island, so you can imagine how tense that is. And upon walking up to the building stairs, right, the entrant really has 2 choices, right? You can walk through a door to the left, or you can walk through a door to the right. And in the left-hand space, BBC members hear an American Black Power-inspired message of Black liberation, anti-capitalism, and anti-colonialism. On the right, nation adherents hear a spiritually grounded message that taught that Islam is the way out of colonial subjugation and white oppression. So this is really interesting, right? Like, if you're a Black person in Bermuda and you're dissatisfied with your social position and your political power, all you really have to do is go to this one building, and you can choose whatever speaks most to you, clearly to you at that moment. Friends and family are often split between the Black Beret Cadre and the nation, between the left door and the right door, right? But how did people actually make that decision? So I want to tell you about Michelle and her friends, and about the internal battles amid the external changes that were happening in Bermuda that eventually led them to the Nation of Islam story. So Michelle and her friends flirted with both the Black Beret Cadre and the nation. Eventually, they picked the nation. And often the conversations that young people have with themselves about which movement spoke to them had to do with what it is that they wanted to become culturally, politically, or in terms of racial identity. Najia Shamsuddin, for instance, this is Michelle's cousin, looked at her choice between the Black Ray Kadra and the nation as a decision over whether she wanted to be, quote, a cultural nationalist, a political revolutionary, or a Muslim. Shamsuddin grew up in a very politically active and Black conscious family. Her father had a copy of Elijah Muhammad's message to the Black man in his home, prominently displayed. He went to Martin Luther King Jr.'s March on Washington. In May 1968, their living room was a staging ground for the first Black voter registration drive after the implementation of universal suffrage in Bermuda. And Shamsuddin, as a teenager, physically carried those registrations. So it was a really easy transition for her to political activity. In high school, she joined the Progressive Labor Party youth wing. This is the party that in Bermuda that represents racial political change. And after she graduates from high school, she moves to New Jersey for 6 months, where she spends time at the Black Panther Party office in New York. By 1970, even though she was in a relationship with the leader of the Black Ray Kadra, she allows herself to be convinced to attend a Nation of Islam meeting by one of the Fruit of Islam who milled about in front of the Bassett building. And that forced her to have a very serious conversation with herself about how she wanted to participate in Bermuda's political transformation, culturally, politically, or religiously. Maybe these distinctions seemed a lot sharper than in 2015 when I interviewed her than maybe they were at the time. But at the end of the day, Shamsuddin's choice was between the secular and the sacred. And she chose what she felt was the nation's religio-political message over the BBC's purely political message. Like Shamsuddin, her younger cousin Michelle, with whom we began this talk, found herself a prominent and vocal member of the Black Ray Kadra. At first, also through the Progressive Labor Party's youth wing. As a teenager, Michelle immersed herself in Fanon's Wretched of the Earth, the autobiography of Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King Jr.'s letter from Birmingham jail. Through these intellectuals and theorists, Michelle tried to connect to a Black diasporic identity that she felt eluded her at home. As the biracial daughter of a Black woman and a white Bermudian man, Michelle read these thinkers to make sense of the racially dystopian world she lived in, where her family itself was separated according to color and race. But by the time she reached 15, she was prepared to challenge the Bermudian racial hierarchy, the oligarchy, and white hegemony. In the summer of 1969, Michelle joined the Black Ray Kadra with her cousin Najia. And like her, she was attracted to the anti-colonial, pro-Black, and Black internationalist message of the BBC, as well as its social outreach programs. She was extremely visible. She spoke publicly at rallies and leading marches. But in 1970, Michelle also found herself persuaded to skip a meeting and attend a Nation of Islam meeting by her parents' friend. Uncle Sai, who was an early Nation of Islam member and known by the authorities in instructing other members on how to make Molotov cocktails. Michelle told me that, in truth, it was really the scores of really handsome, eligible, clean-cut Black men outside the Bassett building that really didn't hurt their pitch at all. But she said that ultimately she really followed Uncle Sai to the nation's meeting space because of the intimate connection that they had with each other as neighbors and friends, right? She trusted him. And inside the mosque, Michelle discovered a message that combined religion, spirituality, and politics, driven by what she perceived as Elijah Muhammad's lack of fear of the establishment. So Michelle recruited her best friend Wanda, who then recruited her brother Gary, who left a pensions job on the Bermudan police force, and recruited his wife Edna. And that period also saw so many nation members, so many BBC members leave and be attracted to the nation. And as with Wanda, Michelle, and Najia, among others, the mosque now had a critical mass of young, unmarried women who left the Black Ray Kadra for the nation. And many of these women who were not content with staying at home left Bermuda to explore the world. They found themselves on the African continent, in the United States, at the nation's Mosque No. 7 in Harlem, and in the United Kingdom. So these women are representative of a phenomenon that became commonplace in Bermuda. Families, friends, neighbors, and lovers often found themselves split over the best practices for fomenting revolution. And the reasons that Barbadians picked one organization over the other were largely personal, but there seemed to be very little friction between the two organizations. While people didn't belong to both at once, both organizations worked together to achieve mutual goals. Michelle had so the nation continues into the 1970s when, like the rest of the Black Muslim world, it's rocked by the death of Elijah Muhammad and the transition to Sunni Islam. Tensions rose, some stayed with the nation, some transitioned to Sunnism, some decided to leave Islam altogether. At this time, Michelle had left the island. Her and George decided to transition to Sunni Islam. And so when Farrakhan called them in 1977, they decided that they had already moved on from that version of Islam. That had served a purpose at a particular time and in a particular place. But now they were standing at a new intersection of Black Muslim identity, political engagement, and thought, and they decided to go their own way. And of course, there are Muslims in my story who decided to follow Farrakhan. And we don't have time to tell all of those stories, but I hope that you'll read about them in the full book. Thank you.
Can you just help me understand, like what is distinctive in these sort of ideas that come from Islam that might have sort of translated into politics? Like you talked about the concept of the Ummah as being sort of, it makes people think in transnational terms. Are there other ideas? I mean, I sort of understand the, it's a non-white religion, not dominated by sort of white nations and white countries, but are there other things sort of intrinsically within the faith that was really appealing and effective?
Yeah, I think that, right, this is a question that obviously I think a lot about, whether or not there is something about Islam, right, that motivates these people, right, like to use it as a scaffolding, like for their liberation movement. I think that, like you said, there are certain concepts that I think like lend themselves easily, right, to this type of transnational thinking, right, like the Ummah. I also think that it being a non-Christian religion, a religion that is rooted right in the African continent, right, is something that right, like that my subjects, the people that I'm interested in studying and are extremely interested in and extremely motivated by, right? This is something that really is kind of indigenous to them, right? That it's not something that's imposed from the outside, that it's something that is almost like primordial, right? Part of their like DNA, constitution, right? Like obviously religion is not genetically transmitted, but right, like they think that this is something that is like a part of them, right, historically. And I think that so I think that has a lot to do with it. I also think a lot about whether there is something actually about Islam, right? Because Islam is associated, right, in the New World with a lot of uprisings, with a lot of rebellions, right? Is that simply a colonial imposition? Is that simply when we look at the documents, right, that the colonial authorities are the ones that are making these types of claims that like there's something about Islam, right? There are various points in colonial history, like where various empires decide they're not going to import any more Muslims, right, because there's too much trouble. But then there are other times when they want to import Muslims because they think of them as smarter, as more intelligent, as better leaders, as right, like as all these other things. So I think that I don't know, right? I mean, like I hesitate to say that there is something actually intrinsically special, but I think that one of the things that my subjects do right, is to make an argument that there's something special about it. And those are the things that I'm interested in, right?
Questions?
Yes, thank you. Yes, hi, my name is Bella. I'm a master's student in the history department here at Stanford, and I was a bit curious, especially since you mentioned the influence of South Asian immigration on Islam in the Americas, if there was like any notable Shia influences or like Shia parts of it, and how the Shia-Sunni divide kind of manifests itself within Islam in America.
Yeah, okay, so that's a really good question, and that's not something that I've actually, I'm not saying that there isn't, right, like that, like Black Americans don't, really aren't looking at Shiism. In the communities that I'm looking at, it's not, they're more either looking at Sunnism or they're taking almost a completely different approach. Like, and I think that it's more common, particularly like in the earlier part of the 20th century, for people to be pulling on various like Islamic reference and symbols, right? Using things like reference to the Quran, reference to, right, like an Ummah, reference to, right, like without actually, without coalescing these things into something that I think the vast majority of practitioners of Islam would recognize as such. I don't personally think that I'm in any position to critique somebody else's religious practice and what they identify as their religious practice, right? So my subjects say that they're Muslim, I'm like, they're Muslim, right? Like, so let's figure out like what that practice looks like for them. I'm not, you know, I don't think that it's my place to critique that. So yeah, I think that as I said, like the more common thing, right, is that people are like, what are these people? What are the pieces of Islam that we can kind of use? And a lot of these movements actually like don't really fit into either Sunnism or Shiism, especially in the early part. It's not until maybe like the 1960s that we really see the transition. Although in the earlier part of the 20th century, there are some movements. Right?
Oh, could I just ask a little follow-up on that? Yeah, that does make sense. Just like within just that context, since I know like the later part, as you mentioned, does take more influence from Sunni, even if it doesn't like really fall into the Sunni Shia divide. And I'm also like fully willing to just like, if they prefer, if they just call themselves Muslim, even if they don't like really fit in, just like kind of like take that and just kind of look at it. I'm also good with that. But then my question would sort of be, do you think there's any particular reason that they were seemingly more drawn to taking elements that are associated with Sunni Islam instead of Shia?
I think that it has to do with exposure, right? So, like for instance, right, like so when I talk about like these three overlapping diasporas, like one of them being, right, like this diaspora of South Asian people. In the beginning of the 20th century, right, like most of that has to do with most of that influences from Ahmadiyya Islam, right, which is not Sunnism at all, right? Like it's its own thing. But then in the later period, right, we have people like, I mentioned him, but I didn't really, I toyed with the idea of maybe doing something on like the second chapter, which is a biography of this Pakistani journalist named Abdul Basit Naeem. And he's Sunni, and he like serves as a consultant for the Nation of Islam, right? So in the 1950s, we begin to see people who were acting as consultants like for these movements. He acts as a consultant for the Nation, he acts as a consultant for the Muslim mission in America, right? Like, so And he, right, so there are various Black movements that are kind of like seeking people out, right? And the people that they happen to be seeking out are Sunni. So I think that it's like an exposure situation, right? If they're like, this person is Muslim, we need somebody to advise us. That person just happens to be Sunni, right? Like so.
Other questions?
Thank you. You characterize the Crescent, as you talk about it, in very transnational terms. What I'd like you to talk a bit more about is the outward transnational look. That is, to what extent are the people you're talking about concerned with what's happening to Islam in the rest of the world? There are not only momentous events in what we call the Middle East, but there's Iran, there's the separation of India and Pakistan. Stuff is happening around the world. The independence of Indonesia and Malaysia are important events in the global history of Islam. And to what extent are these people either thinking about those, engaged in those, talking about those, activists in those? And if not, I take your comment to mean that not much. If not, why not?
Yeah, so actually, thank you so much for that question, because actually that's the entire first half of the book, which is exactly about, right, the extent to which people that are, Black people that are identifying themselves as Muslims in the United States from various heritages, right, whether they're Caribbean, whether they're African American, are actually trying to look at what is happening internationally. And this is a time where, right, as you said, like there's the partition of India and Pakistan, right? Like we see Islam and Muslim nationalism being the foundation of a lot of independence movements. There's rapid decolonization, right, like of the third world, an attempt, right, like of empires to kind of like tamp these things down. And so, I mean, all of these movements, right, like from the Nation of Islam, right, to the Ahmadiyya, to the Muslim Brotherhood, right, all of them are thinking about this, and they're all publishing about them either in their own publications or in publications like black niche publications, right? Like they're taking up space to make these connections, and in particular, right, the Nation of Islam is putting these things next to each other, right? Like so you'll see something about, say, like independence in right, that you'll see something about, like, I don't know, like fighting in India and Pakistan, right, like with juxtaposed against some sort of article about Black separation in the United States, right? So they're making a very clear, I think, connection. People have argued before that that makes the way that the Nation of Islam kind of did its newspapers like look schizophrenic, right? That it just seems like they're like doing anything, like just like here's an article on separatism, here's an article on Malaysia, here's an article on this other thing, here's an ad about suits, right? Like, but I think that actually it's very intentional, right? Like when you look at the way that these things are laid out, the way that they're having a conversation with each other, I think that those things are meant to be put into conversation with each other, right? These ideas about internationalism and about what's happening domestically.
Yeah, I have actually tons of questions, but like a follow-up to Bella's question. So a few years ago, somebody like an African Muslim came here, and he shared with the audience his story. He said, "Do you know that I grew up in Iran? And apparently, after the revolution in Iran, 1979 revolution." Like there were somebody, at least there were some people who immigrated to Iran, responded to the calls of Khomeini, and his message, and his part of his support of the revolution basically, and adopted the revolutionary version of Islam. And more strikingly, a couple of years ago I was going through Malcolm X's grandson's story, who was killed in Mexico. So apparently during the last few years of his life, he was much more associated with the pro-Iran circles in the US. And I found it very striking, and do you have any comments on that? And second, I'm curious about the particular influence of Islamism on Black American Islam in the US in terms of the fact that, because, you know, like people like say Qutb, they are African and they also talk about liberation as a discourse. And I had read somewhere about, you know, like how the Islamist discourse has shaped some of the politicians over here. And can you elaborate on that as well? Thanks.
Yeah, okay, so I think that's the second question. Okay, so let me do the second question first, because I think about that. So, yeah, there's been, right, the influence, I think, of various Islamist movements and various, right, nationalists, but like the Saudis in particular, like, have invested a lot of money and did invest a lot of money, right, in Islamic education, right, for African Americans and Black people in the Caribbean. Like the Muslims that I was talking about in this particular presentation, right, like when they start to convert to Sunni Islam, right, there's a delegation of Saudis that come and they want to talk to them, they want to invite them, right, like to kind of have this like experience, right, in Saudi Arabia, and a lot of it has to do with, right, trying to push like particular ideologies, right, like types of ideologies. And so I think that, like, yeah, I mean those types of philosophies, like, are always present, and I think that people will find solidarities right between like different ideas about revolution, but like in the period that I'm talking about and in the people that I talk about, I don't really think that they really go down those particular roads. But there are people who do, right? Like, and I just don't, you know, I'm just not, I don't think that I'm knowledgeable enough to speak about that. Okay, so your first question was about
Iranian revolution and Khomeini's influence on.
Oh, and Black people claiming solidarity with that.
Basically,
And going to Iran.
like the Khomeini's project of exporting revolution and influencing Muslims, like using religious soft power over Muslims worldwide, and part of that being the blacks, and even some of them responding to this call and immigrating to Iran. And Balkans, like Crescent, you know, being more associated with them.
So I think that from a revolutionary standpoint, or like from a standpoint of trying to mobilize people to participate or to support revolution that have been constantly just like oppressed by their government, it's a smart strategy, right? To reach out to African Americans, and various governments have done it, right? There have been connections between China, right, and Black Americans, Russia and Black Americans. It is very common for people, for governments that aren't like an enemy of the United States, to reach out to thought leaders in the Black community and to say, hey, come to our country, right, so that we can actually show you our like revolutionary project. Cuba, same thing, right? Like the Nation of Islam sent a delegation there, I think in like I'm not sure, I think it was in the 1970s. But, and so I think that like these are very easy associations. The problem with them, I think, as you're implying, right, is that there are not exactly, right, it's like these Black Americans are only being shown like a very particular, right, like experience in these places. They're only being shown a very particular type of ideology, right, which seems to support a relationship between, right, African American people and revolution, and Iran and revolution, and the USSR and revolution, and China and revolution, and Cuban revolution, like whatever it is, right? So I think that like you obviously, right, people need to be careful with that, but I also think that, you know, it's hard because it's like African Americans just want like solidarity with somebody. They can give them something better, right? Like than what they currently experience. I mean, there's no people that are as maligned, right? Like in this country, right, than African Americans, right? Like even the example of Afro-Caribbeans that I give, they don't want to be associated with African. Nobody does, right? So I think it's a way to regain some power, but I think that, you know, there has to be caution on it too, right? Otherwise you just wind up aligning yourself with like fascists, right? So.
Thanks a lot. Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
And this is really interesting. This is kind of new training for me. But I guess I'm struck by this kind of anti-colonial, anti-Christian rhetoric when, like at the same time, at least some Southeast European Muslims who migrated to the U.S., like from the Alaina region, were advocating like Christian-Muslim harmony and we can live together. And I know there were probably other, like Ottoman or maybe like Syrian Lebanese Muslims. And I'm wondering how they interact, if they had interaction, because they were like in Boston and New York, like were they interacting? Or I know maybe the Syrian, the Albanian did not have their own mosque. But yeah, just wondering what contact they had with each other.
I'm not sure about Albanians, but I do know that in like Levantine Muslims,
Yeah.
right? Like people from like Lebanon, Syria, they are very, very involved, right, with Black communities in the Midwest, like in the Western United States, and that's one of the reasons that Chicago and Detroit become huge centers for African American Islam, because there are people that are from traditionally Islamic places, right, that are trying to have conversations, right, with these people. The Ahmadiyya movement, right, is one that associates itself very much, right, with those movements, and with, actually, now that I think about it, with Ahmadiyya too, because there's this, it's like a Muslim kind of cultural house called Carib House in Detroit. It's in Highland Park, Michigan, and it's in the center of this like Muslim community that includes Lebanese people, Albanians, Syrians, right? Like, and this is where the leader of the Ahmadiyya chooses to kind of set up his first kind of headquarters in this place, because he's in the center of not only all of these Black people that he hopes to recruit, but also all of these actual Muslims, right? Like that he can then have a conversation with. So.
But did you see any influence in terms of like how Christianity was viewed by Levantine and these Southeast European Muslims relative to other lineages?
Not really. I think that my subjects mostly see Christianity, you know, and this is obviously like a flattening, right, of it, but they mostly position it as like a colonial evil, right, and something that they don't want to have anything to do with, something that has oppressed them for hundreds of years and that they need to kind of overcome. So if there are, right, like these ideas about solidarity between Christians and Muslims, they're not really existing in my subjects in this period of time, in this particular period.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Excellent, thank you very much. I want to expand more upon your ideas of third world solidarity between Black and Muslim liberation groups. In the 60s, and the creation of U.S. Aid and Peace Corps in 1961, excuse me, And then in the back, I saw this in 1866. There was an American snake taking over the world. How did the Black Muslim liberation ideas coincide with or come in conflict with U.S. aid? And was U.S. aid one of the reasons, most of it, Cold War, counteract the influence of the USSR, but also you gave me some different ideas. Maybe there was some kind of countering the Black Muslim liberation ideas from the United States, imposing itself on the newly independent countries of Africa.
I'm not sure how, for instance, right, the U.S. aid would have seen its role in countering any Muslim, right, influences abroad. I haven't seen that specifically, but what I will say is one of the things that I have seen, right, is typically the United States historically being very nervous about the exportation of things like Black power, right, or Black Islam, and of colonial governments being very nervous about that as well, and them kind of working its hands on to shut that down. So it wouldn't surprise me if, for instance, the United States worked with, say, the United Kingdom or France on like former colonies, right, to kind of like tamp down the influence, right, of these particular movements. Like, I mean, in the Bermudian case, for instance, like, there are stacks of files on Black power in Bermuda. I mean, like, there's just like, they were like, so, there's like stacks about Black power in the Caribbean, right? Like, they are so scared, right, that American Black power is going to, and the ideas of American Black nationalism are going to infiltrate themselves into current colonies or their former colonies. In terms of the way that I think Black people, or Black Muslims would have seen something like US aid, I mean, I think that they absolutely would have seen it as a tool of empire, right? They would have condemned it. I can't think of any specific references to US aid that I looked at from I'm sure if I went back and I looked, these newspapers are so rich, it's like, you could spend years looking, I mean, I have spent years looking, right? Like, I mean, because every time you look at them, you see something different, right? So I think that if I went back, I'm sure I would see something. I wasn't particularly looking at that, but my inclination is to say that just based on the way that they looked at foreign aid, right, as a way to control, right, like former colonies, newly emerging, right, third-world countries and governments, that they would have absolutely seen that as something negative and something to fight against.
One more question?
Did the Atlantic Crescent connections play any role in the development of the Nation of Islam ideas about food?
Oh,
the
yeah.
bean pies and the Virgin lima beans, where did all this stuff come from?
So that comes from like a mishmash of like, so all of these aversions come from like an aversion to the types of foods that Black people were forced to eat during slavery, right? So it's, right, so they reject pork, one because, right, like pork is not permitted, right, in Islam, but also because Black people were forced to eat it, despite, right, like whatever their religious inclinations were. Lima beans, I'm not sure why lima beans in particular. There's certain types of roots and things. All of these have to do with like things that their people are being forced, you know, kind of against their will to eat. But the whole food thing is super interesting, and I like actually have this like side project that I've been wanting to do for years. It's like a cookbook of the Nation of Islam with like stories about like the reasons why, right? They have certain things, and you know, and a lot of it is like complete quack science. But some of it actually is not that far off from the way that we understand food to be healthy now, right? So for instance, like they had a whole, I remember one, they had this whole spread on like how you should not eat white bread, like how white bread, like bread without any fiber in it, is bad for you, right? Like I think that they made the argument that it was bad for you because it was white, but but indeed, right? Like you should actually eat bread with fiber in it, right? So it's interesting, right? Like when you look back on these things, and you're like, oh, okay, well, actually, they were kind of right about that, but like for the wrong reason. But a lot of it just has to do with an aversion to certain foods because of slave diets.
Last question?
Can I ask one more?
No.
You can ask as many questions as you want at dinner, Leo.
Well, thank you so much for your research and for the presentation today. My question is actually about parallel. So, as you continue to reference Black liberation through sacred ideology, whether it be NOI or any other kind of body-based mission-driven resistance. And I'm curious as to how, like, what the environment in the U.S. in particular, how that differed than other spaces where similar liberation movements were happening, whether it be colonization, whether it be independence, and how, in particular, the Black community coalesced as an example of the Nation of Islam. So what was that unifying piece and that environmental circumstance that allowed that to grow here, where in other places it's more about nationality, or tribalism, or whatever it is. So what's that piece? I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice. So what was the soup in the U.S. that created the environment for this particular type of expression of liberation movements?
Right. I mean, I think that the thing in the U.S. really is like the extremely, right, so for instance, in the United Kingdom, right, yes, there are people, like there are Black people, and there are people from like traditionally Muslim places in the United Kingdom before, you know, the end of World War II, but their numbers are limited, right? Like in the United States, I feel like the part of the reason that Black people are able to make and feel the need to make a robust ideology, right, for Black liberation is because of the hundreds of years of bondage in the country that they're currently in, right? I feel like the dynamics are a little bit different, in places like the UK, and even so, right, like there is a nation of Islam in the United Kingdom, right? Like there are Muslim liberation movements, right, in the United Kingdom, and I really do look forward to like looking at those more right in depth. In the Caribbean, there are iterations of the Nation of Islam, there are iterations of Muslim nationalism. A lot of them look different simply because of the types of populations, right, that there are. I really think that the thing that makes all of this happen really is like the intersection, and this is one of the things that because I asked myself the same question that you're asking, which is like, what is special about this particular context and these particular people? And I really do think that what it is that at this particular moment in time, at the beginning of the 20th century, there are these three diasporas that just come together, and that people often just look at them separately, right? If you think the Great Migration, African Americans, Afro-Caribbeans, maybe sometimes you look at them in concert with African Americans, but nobody is really looking at like South Asians in contrast, in conversation with like all of these other things, and the intersection of like what happens when we put these three populations in the same spaces, right? Sharing the same ideas, having experiences across the diaspora with colonization, decolonization, right? Like, and I think that that's actually the thing that makes, I think that's the soup, right? Like, I think that that's what makes this possible, and that's what creates a context. And that doesn't mean that it doesn't happen elsewhere and can't help it happen elsewhere. I just think that it looks different, right, than it has been.
We're at time, but it's your program.
We have time. There.
Okay. It's up to you, you're in charge.
Oh, you're in charge.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you so much.